Welcome, folks. People are joining the call. Just gonna give a few seconds here. Allow people to get situated. We'll get started. See lots of familiar names and people joining the call today. Thank you so much for joining. My name is Tyler Colburn. I am the professional development consultant here with the Nova Scotia College of Social Workers, and you are joining us today for our Lunch and Learn with Amy Pinell, the sensitive social worker, and it's around understanding social work burnout and how to prevent it. Obviously, this is a very pervasive and challenging issue that is experienced by all sorts of helpers, not just social workers. And we also know that it's one of the key areas of focus for supporting social workers at the college, and that's obviously part of our mandated topics as well for professional development. So I know there's lots of interest for people attending today. We have 183 people registered, which is amazing. So lovely to see all of you folks here. I'm going to get started with a land acknowledgement, but before I do that, I'm going to post some links in the chat. There is a check-in question there. I'm going to encourage folks to check in by naming the land that you're on, sharing your names and pronouns. You can also share a little bit what motivated you to attend today, and anything else that you want to share that help ground you into the space as we begin our call. So please join me in this line acknowledgement through the chat as well. And I want to begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking from Guwagage, which is colonially known as Citadel Hill here in Halifax. It's located on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq. The inherent rights of Mi'kmaq were recognized in the Peace and Friendship Treaty signed from the Mi'kmaq, Maliseet, and the Passamaquoddy peoples from 1725 to 1779. This series of treaties did not surrender Indigenous land, resources, or sovereignty to the British Empire, but instead established rules for an ongoing relationship between nations. Canada later reaffirmed the treaties in Section 35 of the Constitution Act of 1982, and they remain active to this day. So I encourage you folks to take time to pause in reflection and gratitude for the land where we live and work. And for me, this is here in the Chipuktuk area. I live in Punamukutijik, colonially known as Dartmouth, but I'm really privileged to be able to join the call today from the office of here at the College of Social Workers. When we begin to acknowledge the land, it's also helpful for many to acknowledge the ways that we are also nature. The topic of today is around understanding social work burnout and how to prevent it. And perhaps there's also a relationship between our understanding of ourselves as nature and the prevention of burnout. So on the right hand here, there's a picture of a tree stump and a human fingerprint. And just trying to remind folks that this is um, a way to help us understand that we are also a part of nature. We're not that different from nature. This quote from Decolonial Futures on the bottom says, "Understand that the earth is not an extension of our bodies, it's the other way around." So perhaps we could deepen our commitment to decolonization and the prevention of burnout by understanding the ways we are expressions of nature. Let us take a moment to pause in gratitude for all who have and continue to heroically care and advocate for this beautiful land. May we join them in the sacred work, thinking about land defenders and water protectors here in Mi'kma'ki, across Turtle Island, and throughout the world. Let us ground ourselves in the wisdom of the land-based Mi'kmaq teachings and values that we must all begin to learn. Let us work to decolonize ourselves, our practice, and this community that we share by working for justice for all living beings as an expression of our gratitude for being here. Let us take a deep breath and recenter ourselves away from the violent ways colonization fills our world and fills us. And let us take a deep breath and work on letting go of the unconscious bias that is everywhere inside and out. I also want to draw to mind or bring mind or bring attention to the ways that settler colonialism and white supremacy and capitalism structure how we think and intervene on issues of burnout and self-care and community care, and hoping that you can carry that thread through this presentation today. Reminders, well, that we're all treaty people. And as we hold on to this knowledge, how does this impact what we do and how we do it? How will it guide our work together today and going forward? And of course, here at the college, we are grounding our professional development and our activities in the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action and the responsibilities for regulatory bodies to help shift the practices towards decolonization. You're welcome to learn more about our commitments and our practices here around decolonization and indigenization at the link below. It's also posted in the chat. Separate and distinct from a land acknowledgement is our commitment to reparations of people of African descent. And it's important to consider that the forces of settler colonialism are directly entangled with the forces that led to the enslavement and displacement of people of African descent. And for us here at the college, our commitment is really grounded in restitution, compensation, rehabilitation, satisfaction, and then guarantees of non-repetition. And so we're thinking a lot about the ways that social work is deeply implicated in the harms historically and in present day for people of African descent. And when we're thinking about reparations for people of African descent, we're considering the history of people here in Nova Scotia across the historical 52 distinct communities that really come from the folks that were the Black Loyalists and the Maroons to the Southern American Black refugees. And we're considering the ways that the legacies of these communities have indelibly shaped Nova Scotia's cultural and political landscape. So we're going to transition now into the session, but I just want to remind folks that this is part of our mandated topics, so the prevention and managing of vicarious trauma and secondary stress. So as you're completing your renewals, which are going to be opening up probably end of October, early November, can't believe this year's gone by so fast already, you can track this session as part of preventing and managing vicarious trauma and secondary stress. If you've already completed your 2 hours for the year, you're also welcome to put this under formal professional development. And again, and all of our sessions are driven by our new Code of Ethics and Standards of Practice, which we'll learn more about as the year goes on. But this is really grounded in Value 4, valuing human relationships, and then Value 7, providing culturally responsive, competent professional services. So some framing for our time together. Just want to encourage folks to think about the ways that we can challenge consumer mindset and realize that we all have different experiences and knowledge, and we bring that into the space. So I encourage you to think about the ways that your engagement with this session may not have immediate and or practical applications for you, and that is okay. Some people will have their expectations met 100%. Others might have more time to process or think or to reflect. You don't have to agree with anything presented or shared, but ask you to be curious and be open to seeing what happens. Take responsibility for yourself by observing and learning from your conscious and unconscious responses. And then today is a webinar. We only really have access to the chat functions and the Q&A, but it's up to you to decide how much you want to share and participate. Perhaps you're joining the call eating your lunch and want to be more passive today. Perhaps you're joining the call and you have lots of questions. Both are okay. And then finally, we can all engage in ways that support others. So this is not a place for healing, but healing can happen here. Some objectives, we're hoping that you build some knowledge and some skills around this prevention of vicarious trauma and secondary stress, and then also maybe shift some of your personal relationships to burnout and how this may impact practice. With that, I'm going to introduce Amy, who is the sensitive social worker. And I just wanted to name that I first became aware of your work through your Instagram presence. I think you have 29,000 followers at this point. I was just looking this morning, which is amazing. And Amy does lots of really great work around education and supporting social workers around this idea of being a sensitive social worker, the prevention and management of burnout and resilience and boundaries. And I highly encourage you to check out her Instagram page. Lots of really amazing content there that has definitely helped me, and I would self-identify as a sensitive social worker. With that, Amy, I'm going to stop sharing and pass it over to you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for that lovely introduction and also such a beautiful land acknowledgement. I'm just going to get myself set up here to share my screen. Okay. There we go. Can everyone, can you see that okay?
It's coming through great for me.
Perfect. All right. So as Tyler said, we're talking about social work burnout and how to prevent it. And also, as he said, I'm Amy. So I'm a registered social worker and a clinical therapist. I currently smack dab in the middle of Mi'kmaq. My pronouns are she and her. My ancestry is primarily from the UK, so a bit of a mix, Scotland, England, and Jersey, which is one of the Channel Islands right off the coast of France. And I was born and raised in Mi'kmaq. So I completed my undergraduate degree at Dalhousie University before moving all the way across the country, pretty much as far as you could go to the opposite coast, to pursue my master's in social work at the University of Victoria. so the traditional and unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples. And during my master's, I worked at a few nonprofits, primarily in homelessness and harm reduction before once I graduated, I moved into working for the local health authority there in mental health and substance use before eventually I worked there for many years before starting my private practice, Brave Spirit, sorry, Brave Spirit Counseling, where I specialize in supporting highly sensitive helpers and healers to prevent burnout and also heal from codependency and perfectionism. So since moving back, I've been back in Nova Scotia for about 3 years and currently work at Nova Scotia Health part-time. So I do private part-time and then part-time with the public system, working with the mental health and addictions adult team here in Truro. And what this resume doesn't show is that 9 months into my very first master's level social work position, I completely burnt out. So graduated 9 months in, and I found myself, physically and mentally very unwell, and I had to leave that role. Looking back, I can see that the role itself was part of the problem. It had an unreasonable workload, but also I really had no boundaries at all. I was not taught how to set boundaries or how to take care of myself in that environment. And I also didn't realize I was neurodivergent. I didn't realize that I was a highly sensitive person at that time. So that time in my life led to the realization that if I was going to make it in this field, if I was going to be a social worker for the long haul, I was going to have to do things differently. I came to realize that as a deep feeler and just an empathetic, sensitive person, that this work really impacts me greatly. And so I really have to take care of myself along the way if I want to keep showing up without getting sick. So that's sort of my own personal journey around burnout prevention. And then eventually, through the years, it became a major focus of my private practice. And it also led to the founding of Sensitive Social Worker, which, like Tyler said, it began as an Instagram account. I just started posting my thoughts on Instagram, and it's now grown into a community of deep feeling, tender-hearted social workers who really want to excel in a mission-driven, purposeful career without sacrificing their own mental health and well-being in the process. And so through Sensitive Social Worker, I offer workshops and talks like this one. I also have some self-directed online courses, and I created the Love Notes for Social Workers card deck, which I took a bunch of those Instagram posts that resonated with people and made them into a little card deck. There's a little picture on the screen there of what that looks like. Um, just so that I just really wanted folks to have something that they could like pull on as they're going through their busy day that would give them a little bit of support and care and compassion. So I've included a couple throughout the slide so you can keep your eye out for those as we move along. So yeah, we're talking about burnout. I'm going to start just talking about what it is, make sure we're on the same page about what social work burnout is, what causes it, and then we'll dive into what we can do, not only to prevent burnout, but really normalize wellness. How can we switch this narrative from, oh yeah, social work, it's inevitable we're going to burn out to, yeah, a culture of wellness. And so I'd love just in the chat, if folks have, kind of assuming you've heard of this term before since you're here, but if in the chat you just want to kind of mention if what you've heard, how you would define it, how you would explain burnout. Um, so thanks everyone who's um, written in the chat there. So isolation, reaching your limits, lack of energy and interest, exhaustion. Yeah, absolutely. loss of self, apathy. Yeah, those are all really, really great examples of what it feels like, right? Too much work and not enough resources, decision fatigue. So a lot of these things are like components, right? Factors, aspects of burnout. And like I think if I could summarize it in the simplest terms, it would just be that feeling of running on empty, right? We have nothing left. The battery is completely depleted. But if we want to get into a little bit more specific detail, the Center of Addiction and Mental Health defines burnout as a state of emotional, physical, and mental exhaustion caused by excessive and prolonged stress. So basically, when we spend too much time with our nervous systems activated in the stress response and not enough time in the rest and relaxation response, we can get to this point of burnout. And this term burnout, I realize it has been critiqued for being too individualistic, and I use it because I think most of us like know what it means, and we can like almost you can almost like feel it in your body when you just say the word. But I do want to acknowledge that. I mean, of course, we know as social workers that everything happens in context, and that the personal is political. So burnout isn't just something that happens overnight or even a week or a month. It's this accumulation of stress over time. And the first step in burnout prevention is actually knowing what the signs are, right? We need to know what we're looking for so that we can make shifts as we need. Stage one is this honeymoon phase where we actually have really high job satisfaction. Often we're feeling enthusiastic and passionate about our work. We're just so excited to be making a difference and doing what we're doing. But if this gets paired with a really strong desire to prove ourselves, we can sometimes end up working in an unsustainable way in the long term. So at this stage, we don't want to get rid of our passion and excitement. We just want to make sure that we're not setting ourselves up for burnout down the road. So essentially, we want to be checking in that we're working at a sustainable pace. Because if we don't, if we end up overcommitting to tasks, projects, clients, whatever it is, we can end up feeling overwhelmed and not able to keep up, which leads to this experience of stress. For some of us, that looks more like presents more as irritability or anxiety or fatigue. Um, and of course, there's going to be stress in any workplace, in any profession. We experience stress. But the key here is that we're noticing that this is coming up for us and we're addressing it rather than just pushing through and continuing at the same pace. Because if we do, that's where we can end up in a state of chronic stress, which is when our stress becomes constant and unmanageable. So here, is where we start to see some more mental and physical issues that we might experience because rather than slowing down and tending to our needs, we just kept working harder, taking on more, pushing ourselves to, those expectations of ourselves, that desire to prove ourselves kept us going and going. So in terms of the physical, it looks different for different people. Sometimes we might have migraines or digestive issues or muscle tension. And often for a lot of folks, it might look like anxiety or depression. And this might be getting a little bit worse than it was at stage two. And then if we continue to keep going, we still don't do anything to take care of ourselves, then we can end up, yeah, this is where we hit burnout. This is where we're depleted and we don't have anything left. And this is when we're no longer able to function effectively in our professional or personal life. So we're drained, and all that excitement and enthusiasm we had at the beginning is gone. So we lose passion for our work, and everything just feels extremely difficult to complete. And then if we keep pushing even further, we just keep going, we still don't slow down, then we can get to the stage of habitual burnout. So you can see how the stress accumulates over time, and it's a progression. And I do want to note that stage 4 and 5, a lot of the strategies I talk about aren't going to be helpful right away. What we need at stage 4 and 5 when we're actually at burnout is a full stop. We need to actually take a full break from the stressors, the things that are contributing to our stress, to allow ourselves to heal and reset. And then all of these others, the prevention strategies come in at stage 1, 2, and 3. And yeah, so you can see how, as I just explained, that burnout is harmful for you. But I've noticed that for a lot of people, the idea that, oh, burnout impacts me isn't actually enough to take action and to make changes. But in reality, experiencing burnout really does impact our clients, our colleagues, our families. It does impact other people. And I believe you're worth care either way, but it does end up having an impact on our work. And so taking time to discuss and assess our burnout levels and build up these burnout prevention strategies really does relate to ethical practice and being an effective social worker. And so the previous professional development consultant, I think that's the role title before, Tyler did their PhD on the ethics and politics of burnout. And this was a few of the points that came out in their research is that when we reach a point of burnout, we actually no longer have the energy to advocate for our clients or for greater societal change, for systemic change. We just don't have the energy to keep going with our social justice component of our code of ethics. When we're really exhausted, it's harder to maintain our professional boundaries. We might end up letting confidential information slip. We might make promises we can't keep. We might be less present when we're sitting down and connecting with somebody. We might not communicate as clearly or as appropriately. And all of these things breach the trust of our clients. So this is just one of the reasons why it's so important that we're talking about burnout today. And then, this point is really important for me to share with you is that, our code of ethics does state that social workers respect the unique worth and inherent dignity of all people and uphold human rights. And I just want to remind you that that includes you, right? You're a part of that. You are people too. So by taking care of ourselves, it is a way that we're actually upholding this social work value. So yeah, I do believe that we have this ethical duty as social workers to attempt to prevent burnout for ourselves and for the folks that we support. And the systems that we work within significantly contribute to the stress that leads to burnout. I really don't want to empathize that this burnout is not an individual failing. It happens in the context of these problematic, oppressive systems, the capitalist systems that we work within. And these are just some types, it really contributes to the stress that we experience that can accumulate over time, including, values conflicts. If we have a different set of values than the organization we work for, if there's a lack of fairness, if there's discrimination, lack of good judgment, if the community is unhealthy or even toxic. So if there's bullying, yelling, racism, and then these things are also just normalized. It's just kind of accepted as part of the culture. Then that's when we get into the state of having a toxic community. And if we're not feeling like we're getting anything at all out of the work, like whether that's having paid time off or benefits or an adequate salary, like if we're not able to pay our rent or our groceries, or we work our butts off and know it, like, our boss never acknowledges it, that's going to add to the stress that we're experiencing. If we don't have any control over timing, schedule, resources, outcomes, and number one is the workload. So essentially having too much to do in the time you have to do it. And so if there are any managers or folks that are interested in management that are tuning in, these are the areas that would be really important for you to pay attention to for your team, because you're going to have more control over these than just the average employee. And addressing these things from an organizational level can really help support, health, social worker wellness, the health of the workplace itself, and reduce turnover. And so you probably noticed just looking at these six stressors that these can happen in any workplace, right? These types of stress can occur in any workplace. And as social workers, we have this additional stress of the emotional and mental energy it takes of holding space for other people's suffering. We're exposed frequently to stories of trauma and hardship. And this is often called the cost of caring or referred to as the cost of caring. And this is why personally very passionate about talking about social worker emotional and mental health, because our job requires mental and emotional energy. So on top of those stressors I mentioned earlier, we also can experience compassion fatigue. So just being exposed, offering empathy and compassion day in and day out, we can get really drained and run out of energy there. We might experience vicarious trauma, which is essentially PTSD symptoms that we experience just from repeated exposure to traumatic stories, just from people telling us about trauma. We can end up with those symptoms. We might actually experience a traumatic situation ourselves, either life-threatening for us, or maybe we witness something. We might experience moral injury where we are forced to work against our values, or we were witnessing systemic injustice. It's really difficult if we're working for an organization and it's causing harm. And then heartbreak. I think this isn't talked about enough, that this work brings up grief. There's loss that occurs. I mentioned here like the heartbreak of witnessing the systems we work for hurt the people we serve, but also we have clients pass away. I worked in substance use for many years and I had many clients die of overdose. And the grief that came with that, was strong. And it was really important that I make space to feel and express that grief. So you can see that there's this emotional labor that is just part of our jobs. And when we're looking at burnout prevention for social workers, we need to take all of this into account. So the good news is that we're not helpless. There are things we can do to take care of ourselves, our emotional and mental health, so that we can keep doing the work that we're passionate about. And before I jump into the strategies I'd love to share, I'm curious what folks have already been doing, or what has your employer suggested? If you could just share that in the comments. If you've ever had, a supervisor or either a clinical supervisor or a boss or manager say, "Hey, here's what you should do." I'm just curious what folks may have heard from other people. Yeah, so working just 4 days a week, that sounds fantastic. I know for myself, I have discovered that that is really important for me, is that I do generally most weeks need an extra day. EAP, so it sounds like someone has just said EAP, okay, you're having issues with burnout and stress, go use your EAP benefits. Mhm. Limiting clients. Escape. So I think that's really common, is finding ways that we can just check out. There's lots of different ways to do that, whether it's TV or reading, video games, taking vacation, taking breaks, taking time off. Yeah, these are great. And clear boundaries between work and home life. Yeah, I'm going to be diving into that. Well, thanks everyone who shared. So when I'm working with folks, I generally support them around these six things. And so I am going to briefly touch on all of them. And I realize that you're all busy and that this is on your lunch break and that you probably already have a massive to-do list. So if this feels overwhelming as I'm going through and you're like, oh no, a whole bunch of things to add to my to-do list, then I really encourage you, one, to just, kind of sit back, just take it in. But perhaps you can look and see, okay, is there one thing that I mentioned today that you're already doing well? And make sure to like give yourself some credit for that. And then is there one thing that you would like to take away from today and maybe give a try or look into more and see if you can offer yourself that as a type of care? So I'm going to dive right in. First up is community care because we deeply benefit from a community of like-minded, compassionate, supportive folks who we can turn to and grow with. So essentially, this is about finding our allies in this work, building reciprocity within our chosen community. So finding those folks who have earned our trust and we feel safe sharing with. And for me, when I heard this term community care in the past, sometimes it felt overwhelming because I think I was imagining, that we had to go like it. I was only practicing community care if I was spending all my free time in community halls and like with big groups, 30 to 50 people planning and doing things and, working towards whatever we were working on. But I realized more recently that community care can be a lot simpler. It can be, which I believe is just as profound as like writing kind messages to each other, expressing appreciation, having short check-ins, sharing memes, leaving voice memos, and really nurturing and building that reciprocity with the folks that we already have connection with. Maybe we still do some networking and connect with others, but really making sure it's like within our capacity, checking in with what we need from our community, but also how am I able to contribute and what can I give with the time and energy that I have left after, I do my day job. Um, and yeah, I think that small acts of kindness and compassion are just really essential in building community. And that part of community care is actually nurturing our workplaces, contributing to creating healthy workplaces. And to me, this means that we actually make space for our colleagues to have and express feelings, to take their sick days without judgment or blame, honoring each other's right to say no. Because over the years, I've worked with lots of social workers, and I was always surprised when there was a lot of judgments towards each other's self-care practices. And, so which is why this blue image here, I shared this on my social media pages just because, just as a thought experiment, like what if we did have the same amount of compassion for our colleagues as we do for our clients? What would that look like in our workplaces? And a while back, I collaborated with one of my colleagues at Brigadoon Village around making this workshop, how to cultivate a supportive workplace culture. So I think Tyler's going to share that with you in the chat, and we'll share that in the follow-up email if that's something you want to look into a little bit deeper. And for me, this idea of collective care, like I almost see it, which comes from disability justice, I almost see it as like a beautiful melding of self-care and community care, where there's space and acceptance that we have different needs, and we allow each other to meet those needs without needing to apologize for that, right? Without needing to justify it. So this quote just says, collective care means shifting our organizations to be ones where people feel fine if they get sick, cry, have needs, start late because the bus broke down, move slower, ones where there's food at meetings, people work from home, and these things aren't things we apologize for. So really making space for each other within our communities. And then next up is talking about deep self-care. And I know self-care, I mean, I know for myself, there has been times when I've gone to my supervisor, my manager, and said, "Hey, I'm overwhelmed. I'm stressed, this workload is too high, and they just said, oh, go practice self-care on the weekend. And that felt very dismissive, like it felt a little bit condescending, like, oh, it's just like, just practice self-care. So I think that sometimes self-care has gotten a bit of a bad rep. And it's definitely not like a complete picture of burnout prevention, but I do believe it still has a place. It's a piece of the puzzle. And so this deep self-care specifically is meaningful self-care practices that foster a deep sense of inner connection, nourish your soul, and bring you joy. It goes beyond simply, watching Netflix or having a bubble bath. Like, I think if we enjoy those things, like absolutely do those things, or if we enjoy, someone's earlier said escape, like if there's things that we do to just kind of escape where we just don't have to use any energy, like we can still do those things. But if that's all we're doing, we're probably not going to feel fully replenished. So to have these really meaningful practices is what's really going to nourish us because you're more than just a social worker. And these types of deep self-care practices are basically what tend to and nourish those other parts of yourself. And these are just some examples. Basically, anything that's creative, if we're tapping into making something, as well as time in nature, meditating, pairing movement and breath, um, cultural, spiritual practices, and silliness and play, right? So things that we do just for fun, but things that really like bring us back to ourselves, and things that afterwards we feel revived and we feel either more connected with ourselves or with the world around us. And you might have heard this term around somewhere of radical self-care. And so, what when does our self-care become radical? Essentially when it defies cultural expectations of self-sacrifice. So this is particularly true for people of color, for folks with disabilities, or chronic illnesses, as well as women. If we've historically been expected to take on caregiving roles or just, basically not have needs and ignore our needs, then essentially practicing self-care. It's about survival and resistance and reclaiming your worth in these systems that devalue it. So, I think in the colonial capitalist society that is built on the hustle and hard work of the marginalized, slowing down and resting and tending to your needs really can be a radical act. And of course, if we're in positions of privilege, we don't want to like use this idea of self-care to, ignore the work that we need to do to stay silent or to just bypass. But we also need our work to be sustainable. So I'm just assuming that you're doing your own critical self-reflection, that you're doing what you can to practice in an anti-oppressive way. Um, and I'm leaving it up to you to decide like when can I integrate self-care and when can I slow down and when do I need to push past the discomfort? Because we're really aiming for sustainability. We all need rest. It's a human need. Um, and that's going to help us be able to do this work for the long term. And Audre Lorde said that caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare. And I just wanted to be clear that we don't need to choose between community care and self-care. We need both. And part of normalizing social worker wellness and shifting away from this, the normalization of burnout, is that we recognize that we all have different needs. So there's going to be people who are more extroverted and community care. They're going to do a lot more community care. They're going to be connecting. They're going to be out there and have a big social circle. And that's going to be really nourishing for them. And there's going to be folks who are more introverted, who maybe need a bit more deep self-care. And we all need both, but what it looks like for each of us is going to be a little bit different, and that's okay. So next I want to talk about nervous system regulation. So we talked before about, we end up stuck in the stress response for too long. So these are strategies that we do to really intentionally shift from the stress response to the rest and relaxation response. So we can do this by, reducing the stressors, the things that cause the stress, or we can do it by completing the stress cycle. So letting our nervous system know that the danger is past, the urgency is past, it is safe to settle and to rest. And we do some of this means taking our time off, but it's helpful to have practices and strategies we can do throughout our workday, throughout our work week. And I think this is another piece that it's where it's really clear that it benefits the folks we work with too, because if we're dysregulated, like if we're operating from this kind of intense state of urgency, our heart rate's elevated and we're like, our mind is full and we're like going from thing to thing. Sometimes we can end up being a little bit more reactive or maybe just not as present and engaged with folks. So if we can settle our nervous system, we're still gonna keep doing what we're doing, but we're kind of doing it from a more intentional place. So part of this involves prioritizing rest and, sleep, I think, is essential, but also there's lots of other types of rest that we need, right? We need rest from making decisions. We need rest from holding emotional space for others. So these are a couple resources here that talk in more detail about rest. And I think that a lot of us feel like rest needs to be earned or rest, like it's kind of like, oh, when I get everything done, then I'll rest. And that's not exactly realistic. Our bodies need rest to function. We need that rest um, to be able to keep going in the long run. And one of the ways that we make sure we have rest is that we actually take our time off. Some folks said this in the chat. So if we have paid time off, it's there for a reason and we take it. And some folks here, this is something I hear a lot, is some of you might also feel guilty if you take sick times, if you have to call in sick. Something that comes up a lot is that we care. We don't want to let people down. But we're just as human as everyone else. We get sick and we also need mental health days. We need time to rest. And giving ourselves this is, again, it helps us keep going in the long term. And I really believe that, we can take our paid time off and still make a difference in people's lives. We can still contribute. We can still show up and do amazing work. So yes, so there's this time off where this is like we're taking a break from the stressor, but we also want to have strategies like throughout the workday. We don't need to stay in this heightened stress response all day, every day. And um, Emily and Amelia Nagowski say that physical activity is the single most efficient strategy for completing the stress cycle, even if it's just jumping up and down or a good cry. So it makes sense. Stress, is a somatic experience. So if we're going to signal to the brain that the stress is past, we probably need some somatic practices. And I think that just adding in movement in any form into your day, like just standing up from your desk or walking across the room or the building, jumping up and down or doing a little dance, like all of these things will help your nervous system in the long run. It might seem kind of silly or simple in the moment, but the more we do add these things in, the better our nervous system, the more resilient it is to carry on. And, if they say that this is the most efficient way, but it's definitely not the only way. And so I wanted to add in a few grounding practices here. These are things that I use regularly myself. So these are some of my favorite ones. And I'm also assuming that you probably, a lot of you here probably teach your clients some of these practices. So, tuning into the five senses, the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 here and now exercise. The butterfly hug is actually from EMDR, where it's, a self-soothing strategy. We give ourselves a hug and we just gently tap our arms, pushing our feet into the floor. Like maybe you want to try this right now, wherever you're sitting. I always think about, I think when we push our feet into the floor, it's this reminder that we're supported, that there is this surface underneath us holding us up. It's a support. And then underneath the structure of the building is the structure of the building. Underneath that is the earth. So in that way, we're always connected to and supported by the earth. And sometimes we just need to push our feet into the floor to remember that, that we are supported. Box breathing, where we, inhale for 4, exhale for 4, or hold for 4, exhale for 4, hold for 4, and repeat as many times as needed. Or we could do a body scan or, like a DBT, they talk about the progressive muscle relaxation. So all of these strategies you can do them in just a few minutes. And if you are teaching these to your clients, I would love for you to just pause and reflect on whether you are practicing them regularly yourself. I think we're really good at sharing these with other people. And we have all this knowledge, but it's another thing to actually practice them and to work them in throughout our workday when it feels like there's not enough time. But generally, we do have 3 minutes, and it might actually make that to-do list easier if we've taken a couple minutes to settle and reset our nervous system. So, I think these are great before or after a client session, before a big meeting we're nervous about, or right at the beginning of the day, before we tackle what's to come. I also regularly listen to guided meditations. There's lots of free ones on Insight Timer. And I've also, like all of the courses the online courses I've created, I've written and recorded meditations that go along that kind of match each topic. So I listen to those too. And it's amazing like how it can shift just how you feel as you go through your day. Um, Yes. So next up is critical hope, and I'm going to be super brief because this was the topic of the Nova Scotia College of Social Workers mini conference this year. So you can go ahead and watch the whole recording. It's up on YouTube. So critical hope is this idea of balancing our critical analysis of the problematic systems that we work within with our vision for a better world. So I've worked with a lot of social workers over the years, like my colleagues, but also my clients in my private practice and through Sensitive Social Worker. And what I've noticed is that we are really, really good at identifying problems. We're really good at paying attention to the things that other people look away from. And thank goodness we do. We need people who aren't going to ignore it, who aren't going to look away. But if we're not careful, we can really get so focused on that. We get swept away into despair, so swept away into it that we end up losing our motivation or losing our belief in that the energy to act. So I think it's important to just think about, it's kind of like that coming back to your why, like why are we doing in this first place? And also kind of connecting with this idea of hope, it allows us to use our imagination to bring forth new possibilities. I think, what the world needs right now probably has never existed before. So we have to use our imaginations and get creative about what that's going to look like. And moving along, right along, talking about emotional care, I talked before about that emotional labor that we provide as social workers. And so we need time and space to acknowledge, feel, and process and express our own emotions because social work is emotional work. And it's going to bring up emotions for us. It's inevitable because we're human. And if we want to maintain the career in the long term and we want to continue to do like really meaningful, mindful, intentional work, we need to be tending to our own feelings along the way. We need to be making space in our work days, in our weeks to make space for our own feelings. And I've noticed too that social workers are really good at containing their feelings. When we're working with a client, when we're working with somebody, we need to be really good at compartmentalizing. I'm sure you've all been in a situation where you are maybe going through something really significant in your personal life. Maybe you've lost someone or, something really intense is going on and you've had to like contain that, put it aside and focus on the person in front of you. And it's a great skill to have. Like I think, that's part of what makes you good at what you do. But if you like just because you put that away and it's not convenient doesn't mean those emotions go away. So it's really important that we are coming back, right? That we have time somewhere in our lives, in our routines where we allow ourselves to tap back in and offer ourselves that care and kindness, the same that we would offer to our clients. This is a practice that I developed for working, it just takes a few minutes. If you're noticing big emotions coming up at work and you just, want to give yourself a little bit of space for them during the workday. So it involves just a quick check-in with yourself, getting curious about what you're noticing, your feelings, body sensations, seeing if you can identify and acknowledge what's coming up. And then from there, once we have a sense of our emotion, we can consider what do I need? And then we tend to our needs with care. And so this workbook is part of a mini course around managing difficult emotions at work, which I think is going to be, Tyler's going to put in the chat for you if that interests you, if that's something you want to look into more. And yeah, so we want to be doing this with self-compassion. And Kristen Neff defines self-compassion as to suffer with. So essentially, when we're compassionate with somebody else, we acknowledge their suffering, we feel moved by it, we recognize there's like a shared connectedness in it, and then we offer some gesture of kindness. So self-compassion is essentially doing the exact same thing for ourselves, right? We're noticing what are we feeling? Is there pain here? Is there hurt? We're recognizing that that experience is part of being human, that, there's nothing wrong with you for feeling that way. And then we do some type of gesture of care. Whether it's, one of the other practices I've mentioned so far, but maybe it's just a hand on your heart and a few deep breaths, or speaking to yourself in a kind way. And there's a lot of myths about self-compassion out there, that it's selfish, that it just means like letting yourself off the hook, not taking accountability. But what the research shows is that when we treat ourselves with compassion, we're actually more likely to make positive change. We're more likely to make amends. We're more likely to take positive action. And I just think about how, a big part of our practice is critical self-reflection, right? We want to be checking our privilege. We want to be like unlearning all of these things that we've learned throughout our life, just being part of this society. But if we're doing that with a lot of harsh critical judgment and we don't have any compassion for ourselves, that's when we actually get stuck in paralysis, right? The shame, the guilt, it gets us so stuck that we end up not doing anything about it. So I really think that this pairing of critical self-reflection and self-compassion helps us make mindful action. So it's kind of holding our humanness while we, see like, well, what do we want to be working on? How can we change? How can we be better and contribute in a different way? And we're at our last component here, which is boundaries, because, and this is a personal favorite of mine. I think partly because it's not talked about as much. It's not talked about. Any workplace that I've been in, I haven't had any supervisor or manager really encourage boundaries. So, and it also is necessary. We need to have healthy boundaries to be able to practice everything else I just shared, right? The boundaries kind of make space and allow us to keep working on these other things. So boundaries are the border that separates you from others, right? Like your skin's a boundary. You have a comfort zone of like how close people can be for you to be comfortable. And then we also have an emotional boundaries, which essentially allow us to have our own identity, our own sense of self, that separates our thoughts, feelings, beliefs, emotions, needs from the folks around us. Boundaries are also the limits and rules we set for ourselves and within relationships around what's safe, what's appropriate, which is really about dignity, honoring our dignity. And then it's also a self-care practice around so it's how we communicate our needs to others, and it's also how we avoid overextending ourselves. How do we protect our time and our energy? And so our social work boundaries, we need to be looking at professional boundaries. We need to be upholding our code of ethics, our standards of practice. But what I've noticed is that that's often where the conversation ends. And as social workers, maybe some of you have been, but a lot of us aren't taught how to uphold our personal boundaries in the workplace because we only have so much time, energy, and emotional bandwidth to give. It's a limited resource. So we want to be mindful about how we're spending it because every time we say yes to something, we're saying no to something else. So we want to be checking in with ourselves about where am I giving my energy? Where am I allocating my time? Where am I giving my emotional bandwidth? And I think, of course, our managers and organizations, they have a responsibility to support us in having manageable caseloads, managing manageable workloads, and healthy work environments. But we do have a responsibility to speak up for ourselves as well. Because if we always say yes to everything, even, the most well-intentioned manager might put too much stuff on our plate because they can't read our minds and they don't always know exactly what's already on our plate. So it can be helpful, so we do need to speak up if we're at capacity, or even just saying things like, here's what I already have going on. What would you like me to prioritize, right? If I'm adding this in, that might mean I have to let something else go. And to have this conversation rather this assumption that we just have to do more, 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 and not speak up for ourselves because boundaries are about having our own back. It's about building self-trust. Sometimes this means saying no or not right now or let me get back to you. But sometimes it just also means just following through on what we said we would do, right? If I promise myself that I'm gonna leave work on time, like 3 days a week, then it builds self-trust if I actually follow through with that. And boundaries is such a big topic that I developed an entire 6 module course on it. So each of these modules have multiple video lessons, meditations, and a workbook. And what I've noticed is, the barriers to setting boundaries. Sometimes it's that we don't know how, we don't have the right language. Sometimes it's that we don't like realize we have the right. We don't realize that it's even an option. And sometimes we recognize, okay, like, sure, that's great in theory, but we don't necessarily believe that we deserve to. And so all of those things are addressed in the first part of this course. Um, and yes, you do deserve to. And then I go into the specifics around emotional boundaries. So this is essentially about how do we stop feeling like an emotional sponge, right? If you feel like you're moving through your day and you're soaking up the feelings of everybody else, how do we leave work at work? And how do we maintain our sense of self within the work? And then there's a whole module on time and energy boundaries. So how do we end the workday and actually still have some energy for our personal lives, including like closing energy leaks, like noticing, is there places where I'm like accidentally giving energy that I don't need to? And then within, the limits of my workplace, is there ways that I can take control of my schedule? Is there areas where I can like make it more efficient for myself? And looking at also what gives us energy, right? What are the either the populations that we work with or the activities or the projects, like making sure that we at least have some of those things in our schedule, the things that actually drive us. And then looking at communicating boundaries, because this looks different, those professional boundaries with your clients look different than saying no to a coworker or saying no to a boss. And we want to be able to do this with confidence and kindness. And then finally, this last step of establishing healthy boundaries is actually maintaining the boundaries. So what do we do when there's in the face of pushback? And when is it time to just leave? Like, is there a point where leaving is the boundary that we need to. And so, in essence, what we're talking about here, when I talk about burnout prevention, really I'm talking about giving yourself permission to be human. So, giving yourself permission to have feelings, to have needs, to be impacted by your workplaces, and to tend to your own needs. This is really is the key to burnout prevention. And the more we ignore, suppress our own emotions and our own needs, the more likely we are to burn out. Because you are more than what you give to others. And, each and every one of you here are human beings. You have complex histories, you have emotions, you have needs, you have hearts and souls, and you deserve compassion and the ability to live a fulfilling life as much as anybody else. So what's next? These resources are going to be sent out. They're going to be in the chat, and they're also going to be sent out. But I have a free quiz if you want to just kind of get an assessment of where your boundaries at work are right now, if they're healthy, if maybe they could use some work. There's the Cultivate a Supportive Workplace Culture Workshop, which I mentioned earlier. I have a mini course on managing difficult emotions in the workplace, and then also a mastering emotional boundaries mini course. But there is talk about providing a webinar through the Nova Scotia College of Social Workers specifically around emotional boundaries. So you can keep your eye out for that as well. And then, of course, there's the full boundaries for burnout prevention course, which I mentioned a few slides ago. And that's all for me.
Hi, Amy. Thank you so much for sharing everything. And I just want
Yes.
to reaffirm that the links are in the chat for folks who want to look up these courses, but they're also going to be sent out in the follow-up email that'll go at 4 o'clock today. There are a couple questions, Amy. One that's come
Sure.
through that could be really helpful to explore is from Deborah Bork, and it says, does burnout present differently in neurodivergent folks?
Well, I think that does it present differently? So like would the signs be different? I mean, I think that from the outside it might look very similar, but internally probably the cause and the reason will be a little bit different. Like I'd say one of the biggest things with neurodivergent folks is like our sensory needs, and just the overstimulation piece. So any type of neurodivergence, there's usually some sensory piece. So I know, it's not always just about all those things I mentioned. Like sometimes it's also the toll of having like, fluorescent lights on all day. So like there's lots of little things we can do to support ourselves as neurodivergent folks that way. And I think that burnout, like, I gave kind of some general things that people experience, but it actually can look a little bit different for everybody. And I think that would be the same for the neurodivergent folks, that each person's going to look a little bit different.
Yeah, that's very timely for me. One of my coworkers came over to ask me, "Are you okay?" Because for like the first 2 hours of my workplace today, I was fussing with a fan that was on. I'm neurodivergent,
Mm-hmm.
and sometimes the noise was vibrating, and it was driving me
Yeah.
bananas. And so I definitely can relate to that. Um,
Yes.
do want to point out, and you may have already seen this. There's a few folks asking if there's a way to share your presentation. Is that something you have available, or
Mm.
are there resources on your website that would speak to some of their content?
Well, I think, I mean, we're going to be sharing the whole video on
Exactly, yeah.
YouTube. So it will be available for everyone to like revisit, rewatch. Hopefully that will be enough. I can also send out like the list of resource, like all the references. Like I know I mentioned like I quoted some people, I mentioned books and all of that so
Yeah,
that people can access that. But I think once it's up, it like all the slides will be there in the video.
I think that's plenty. That's standard practice for us. And so, folks, we should have the recording for this available probably in early September. One of our staff members is on a really lovely vacation right now, who is usually doing that. So look for September. We will highlight that in the newsletter. So you'll have to view this presentation on your own time. And again, a reminder that we will be sending out an email with some links and things, and that you can also reach out to Amy directly through social media or through email and book her for your own workplace. I know she's available and does some really great work with folks. So yeah, Amy, thank you so much for being here. I'm going to share a few more things. Would love for folks, if you have time and capacity, to just check out in the chat. I know lots of folks are already doing that and some folks have stepped off. But would love to hear from people, what's an idea that you're taking with you into practice from this session today? Or anything else that you want to share that'll help you close out the session for you. I've already seen lots of that in the chat. And of course, I want to point to upcoming events. We have a lot in September. Amy's probably going to be coming back later in this year and the new year around the boundaries topic. But coming up, we have a queering social work community of practice or not next week. Oh my goodness, it might be next week already. And then we're going to be doing some decolonizing mental health work on September 2nd. Lots of sessions around communities of practice. So we have one for Black and African Nova Scotian social workers, for Indigenous and Mi'kmaq folks and social workers. We have a workshop on anti-oppressive documentation on September 19th. And then I want to point as well for Suicide Prevention Day, we'll be doing a session on where is it? Depathologizing suicide. And then a week later, we're going to be doing one on supporting caregivers in suicide prevention. And then in the fall, we're doing a bunch of road shows around the province. So if you're in Sydney, Antigonish, Yarmouth, New Minas, or in the Halifax area, or if you're nearby, please register for one of the road shows. This will be about our upcoming code of ethics. So we're releasing those and want to be training and onboarding people to these new code of ethics. And then on November 24th, I'm really excited. We're doing a one-day in-person conference on social work's role in addressing gender-based and intimate partner violence. This is also going to be available in the new year as a series of online sessions, but we're going to start with an in-person one on November 24th. Stop sharing my screen. But yeah, again, Amy, thank you so much for being here and sharing all this really amazing content. I know as we were going through it, I was taking notes in my own journal, being like, oh, right. Amy is right. We're great at saying things and not so great at applying themselves or for ourselves at times. So good reminders for many folks, good knowledge and new information for many folks as well, I imagine. And yeah, thanks for being here.
You're so welcome. Thanks for having me. And yeah, a lot of the reminders are things that I also need to be reminded of. So
Yeah,
we're
yeah.
all in the same boat.
Yeah, it's a lifelong journey, I suspect. Yeah.
Yes.
Um, with that, I'll stop recording and stick around for a few seconds if anyone has any other questions.